thank you all for coming out. I am so pleased to have the opportunity to be here with you tonight to discuss with you the histories of the first peoples of the Americas, and it's such a big topic. We're going to cover just a tiny, tiny little bit of it. But I'm very excited to be here, and it's a great treat for me to be back in Texas. My husband's family is Texan, and this is kind of a second home for me. In fact, I was married here in Houston. And I'm so grateful to the Leakey Foundation for inviting me to do this presentation and tomorrow's. The foundation, if you don't know anything about them, they are renowned in our field for funding some of the most critical research, both in primatology and in human evolution. All my friends have Leakey Foundation grants, so thank you on their behalf. I'm very, very excited to be a part of this series. Okay. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking with you all about the latest scientific understandings of how the first peoples came to the Americas. And as is evidenced by this crowd, there's a lot of interest in this subject. And you probably know that there are still many, many questions about this topic. Who were these first peoples? Why did they travel? How did they survive the conditions of the last ice age? How did they adapt to the new lands and the new environments that they encountered? And the peopling of the Americas is a later chapter in the human evolutionary story, but it's still a major part of this story. So, of course, the Americas were among the last continents to be peopled, and they were the last step in our global journey. But they're also an important place for us to learn about the cultural and biological aspects of human migration and human adaptation. So, as you may have noticed if you follow the news, this is a topic in a field which moves very, very quickly. So, thanks to the introduction of this new evidence that we're going to be talking a lot about tonight, DNA, from the genomes of ancient and living Native Americans, we are questioning much of our prior thinking on this subject. And as we'll explore tonight, the field is currently in a period of intense debate about how long people have been in the Americas, how many different peopling events there may have been, and the routes that people took to get here. And so tonight, what I'm hoping to do is what I did with my book, is provide you with an overview of the evidence that we have today and the different models that we have for how this peopling event may have happened. My focus is mostly going to be on genetic evidence because that's my background, but we'll also talk about archaeology quite a bit. So, but before we do, let's take a moment and acknowledge that science is not done in a vacuum, and the results from this research exist in the context of all which we live and which came before us. I'm not trying to make a political statement, I just couldn't help myself. The history of the scientific investigation of the origins of Native Americans is deeply rooted in colonialism and centuries of exploitation of indigenous peoples. And the results of our research today have the potential to deeply impact indigenous communities. And so one of the things that I argue is that we can choose to do this research in a positive way, we being my colleagues and I, but we can only do that if we have an understanding of the ways in which previous research and some current research has harmed and continues to harm indigenous peoples. And we also have to acknowledge and learn from examples of good research, examples that has been positive, that have been researchers who have been accountable to indigenous communities and done the work in a good way. So this theme is woven throughout my book, and I don't have the time, unfortunately, to develop it enough in this presentation, but I will be talking about it a bit. So we can address questions of the past through multiple approaches, and none of these approaches gives us a complete answer in and of itself. Many Native American societies have histories of their own origins, which have been transmitted mostly orally, in most cases, for many, 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 many generations. And some of these align with scientific ways of studying the past, and some of them do not. My focus is on two particular ways of studying the past, archaeology and genetics. But I want to respectfully acknowledge the many ancient perspectives on histories, some of which are understood to be metaphorical, and some of which are taken to be literal explanations of origins. I do not tell those stories myself because they're not mine to tell, but I strongly believe in their importance. And events in the past did unfold in a particular way, but our ability to understand this is limited by the tools that we have and the data that are available. And we might like to think that science gives us all the answers in and of itself, but in fact, as we'll see tonight, archaeology and genetics are not perfectly concordant, and they cannot tell us, they're not the only ways of understanding how history may have unfolded, and the same is true for all these approaches. Okay, so I call myself an anthropological geneticist, and that's a term you probably don't hear every day, so I wanted to define it really quick. Anthropological genetics is a mouthful. It's a synthetic field which applies the methods and theory of population genetics to evolutionary and cultural questions of anthropology. Anthropological geneticists work on all aspects of human and sometimes non-human genetics. But in general, the field addresses these two questions. How do humans differ biologically, and how have aspects of human history shaped those biological differences? Over the last decade or so, genetic approaches, and specifically genomic approaches or studies of complete genomes, have been increasingly common in investigating human history, in investigating everything from population origins to population histories and the biological relationships among diverse human groups. And these are some of the things that DNA can tell us. DNA cannot tell us everything. And I am the first to say that there are absolutely major limitations on what we can learn from DNA. But there are some powerful things which it can tell us. So I and my lab group are most interested in these kinds of questions, and we work with tribes and communities who wish to use DNA as a tool for investigating their own histories. And that's not true of every tribe, but some tribes are very interested in this. Tonight's talk, though, I'm really going to be focusing on the first question. I'm not really going to be talking about my own research. It's not quite in a place where I'm ready to talk about it yet. So I'm going to be giving you an overview of research done. Some of this has been done by me, but a lot of it has been done by other scholars in the field. What's really fascinating about the peopling of the Americas, and I think that this is maybe one of the reasons why you all are here tonight, is that after over a century of study, there are still so many questions, fundamental questions, that remain unanswered. And of course, now we can bring DNA, a powerful new tool, to investigate the answers to these questions. Ancient DNA, or DNA from deceased individuals or organisms, can give us direct windows into past genetic variation. So it can reveal the presence of populations or lineages that are no longer present on Earth, that have no contemporary descendants. But it's a very challenging endeavor. So ancient DNA is so degraded and fragmented, it's really, really sensitive to modern contamination, which is why we have to work in labs like this. And this individual is one of my graduate students, I have no idea who it is, who's working with DNA from soil right now in this picture. And that individual, in order to enter the lab, would have had to not only don this garb, but also bleach the outside of, I'm pretty sure it's one of the female graduate students, her suit and her gloves. And she's wearing a respirator because the bleach fumes are very, very strong in that lab. It's technically challenging to take the precautions necessary, all these precautions that are necessary to prevent contamination. And there are not that many labs across the country that actually can do this. There are more and more, but still they're relatively uncommon. And in addition, it's quite expensive, and most DNA samples that we take from ancestors or from soil or from whatever the source is will not work. Most of them don't have DNA. And you only hear about the cases where it actually does work in the news, but most of them don't. So this field is called paleogenomics, and it is so important that one of the founders of this field, Svante Pääbo, who I met a couple weeks ago, he's a lovely guy, he received the Nobel Prize in 2022 for his work in sequencing the Neanderthal genome. And it's not just hype. The ancient genomes give us an extraordinarily powerful way to understand biological histories of humans, of non-humans, of pathogens, and it can also allow us to reconstruct past ecosystems. So I'm here to talk to you about the genetic origins of Native Americans, but this raises the question, where do you start when you're talking about the origin of a people? In my book, I began with the immediate ancestors of the first peoples of the Americas, and Siberians and East Asians in the Upper Paleolithic. But tonight, in honor of the Leakey Foundation, I'm going farther back into the past. I'm starting farther back in the past, connecting that branch of the family tree to some older events. So the genetic story of modern human origins currently, and I'm going to stress currently because this story can change with every new genome that is sequenced, it currently tells us that sometime between 700,000 and 500,000 years ago, the ancestors of the lineage leading to us, sapiens, diverged from the ancestors of our sister lineages, Neanderthals and Denisovans. And we don't know very many details about this process. So genetics shows us that the common ancestors of all peoples were in Africa, but we don't know exactly what region. We can't pinpoint a specific region for that. It's likely that our lineage was formed from the contributions of multiple populations across Africa and possibly some in Southeast Asia, sometime after 300,000 years ago. Genetic evidence suggests that these populations of sapiens expanded their range earlier than you might think. They expanded their range outside of Africa at least once prior to the late Pleistocene. So we can see evidence of very, very ancient sapiens lineages present in the genomes of some Neanderthals. But whatever population or populations did this, they're not there anymore. So we don't have any actual representatives of it. We can only detect this event indirectly through the genomes of Neanderthals. But about 70,000, 60,000 years ago-ish, sapiens began the major expansion out of Africa, which you are more familiar with probably. And this expansion brought us into contact with Neanderthals, those who left Africa. And then about 60 or 50,000 years ago-ish, I'm being fuzzy on dates, there was an admixture event, so shortly after they left. And that admixture event left detectable traces of Neanderthal DNA in the genomes of every single person who has any ancestry at all from populations outside of Africa. Following that admixture, sapiens populations began expanding across Eurasia, and there may have been probably were, additional admixture events with other Neanderthals and Denisovans as these populations spread out, leading to different proportions of that ancestry in different populations. Beginning about 50,000 years ago, sapiens lineages began to diversify. Makes sense, they're moving around, they're spreading out. We see regional patterns of lineage diversification. Some of these lineages lead to contemporary populations and some do not. Some have left no descendants and we can only detect them with ancient DNA. We can trace one of the strands of Native American ancestry to an individual dating to 40,000 years ago from the Tianwan site in China. Let's see if I don't know if you can see that. There it is, right there. He belongs to a population that bears ancestry shared with some South American populations, and this is referred to right now as population Y. I want to say that all of the names that geneticists use for populations are really terrible, but I didn't pick them, so I can say that. Okay, so population Y was originally discovered as shared affinity between South Americans and Australasians. Some South Americans, not all South Americans. And it's shown in this heat map from a paper from 2015, which the darker colors denote closer genetic relationships. So when people see this, they're like, oh, I know how that got there. But that explanation, a trans-Pacific migration, actually we can rule that out based on current evidence because the genetic patterns seen in South Americans do not fit the predictions of that model. You would expect higher proportions of this ancestry along the coast with sort of gradually diffusing eastward, and in fact, it's the opposite. It's not the opposite, it's just very scattered and random. It doesn't really match that pattern that we would expect. And there are some other reasons, but I'm not going to get into them just now. Thus far, this ancestry has not been found in any North American populations, but as we'll explore later, we don't have that many genomes from North America, so it might be there, we might not have found it. So there are two explanations that are supported by current data for these results. We can't rule out either of them right now. So one of them is that both population Y and contemporary Australasians descend from the same ancient group that was widespread throughout East Asia, and Tianwanmen would have had ancestry from this same group. It formed part of a structured population in Beringia, or wherever the ancestors of the first peoples were, during the Ice Age, the last glacial maximum, which I will talk more about shortly. An alternative model, which again we can't rule out, was that there was this ancient East Asian population carrying this ancestry, and there was somehow a very early migration of that population into the Americas before the Ice Age, before the last glacial maximum, and that when the main migration of the ancestors of indigenous peoples came through the Americas later, there was admixture between these two groups in South America, at least, and that could explain those results. The major thread of Native American ancestry, which makes up about 75%, I mean, proportions vary, but this is the major amount, can be traced to a group that is known genetically, again, a terrible name, as the ancient Northeast Asians. They descend from a group that gradually became isolated from the larger ancestral East Asian population between about 36,000 and 25,000 years ago. It was our models show it was a pretty gradual process. Another of the strands of Native American ancestry has been traced to a group known as the ancient North Siberians, which is represented by the genomes of two little boys from this site right here, known as the Yana rhinoceros horn site. These ancient North Siberians, this population diverged from West Eurasian populations about 39,000 years ago. The Yana site is really important because it shows us that despite still being physically adapted for African environments, at this point, people were, a large group of Homo sapiens were able to thrive in a region where it was bitterly cold. So the average temperature in the winter would have been about 36 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 36 degrees Fahrenheit, which is just mind-boggling. They thrived there in this settlement for almost 200 years. They made clothing from rabbit and hare fur. They flaked stone tools. They hunted rhinoceros. They hunted mastodons. They built their houses out of mastodon bones. Really incredible stuff. But these two children from whom we have genomes, they're actually from their deciduous teeth, their baby teeth, which they lost naturally on the banks of a river. And these two children were not related to each other. So it's two unrelated boys. I imagine in my book they're playing together, but who knows what actually happened. But their genomes can let us model the actual effective population size, not the actual population size, but it's a genetics term, effective population size, and it shows us that it was quite a large population, which is really remarkable thinking about it. We don't know what happened to the population at Yana, but we know that at least one group was descended from them, and that is the population here at the Malta site, represented by the genome of a young boy who was buried there 24,000 years ago. Malta is an incredibly important Upper Paleolithic site in eastern Siberia near Lake Baikal. It was excavated in the 1920s, and archaeologists found a large settlement which included subterranean houses with bone walls. They would have covered them with animal skins. And they found an astonishing variety of objects and art at this site, some of which I'm showing you here. The diversity of objects suggested that people were either staying at Malta permanently or they were visiting the site regularly. And the Malta peoples were among the very last to live in Siberia before the Ice Age, before the conditions of the last glacial maximum made it uninhabitable. So beginning about 20,000 years and continuing through about 15,000 years, there is essentially no archaeological record in Siberia. It seems to have been completely depopulated, which should tell you what it must have been like. And this is where the genetic story of the first peoples of the Americas, we can argue this is where it began. All these threads come together, maybe, unless population Y migrated early, during the Upper Paleolithic to form the ancestral population that leads to the first peoples, which I am calling here Beringian ancestors, and some of my archaeological colleagues might I find that a bit controversial, but we're going to go with it. And the Beringian ancestors were the result of a mixing of ancient North Siberians and this ancient ancestral East Asian group, and possibly population-wide, we're not really sure. And this happened between about 23 to 20,000 years ago, modeled based on genetics. And additionally, Paleo-Siberians, another terribly named group, would then go on to repopulate Siberia, and they also come from this population. So following the mixing of all these different populations, which it can't be a coincidence that this all happened during the last glacial maximum, during this time of climactic upheaval, right? So you maybe have groups coming together in refugia from these climate conditions, and they're in proximity to each other and they're mixing. And then they become isolated. Our best genetic models show that there's absolutely no contact between this population and any other populations in Siberia or Asia. And this isolation goes on for several thousand years, and during this period, there's a lot going on. These individuals this population is evolving genetic variants which we only see in the indigenous peoples of the Americas. And I want to talk for a moment about this isolation. So many of us think that it must have taken place in Beringia itself, which is here, the land connection between Asia and North America. So this is Alaska. It's twice the size of Texas. I like to tell people that. So I think of it not as a land bridge, but as a lost continent. Okay, so that kind of gives you a bit more of a perspective. People are not racing across this land bridge. They are living there, maybe. We don't actually, so we have climate models that show us that it was actually a more decent place to live than anywhere else at this time. So across North America and across all of the Northern Hemisphere, climate conditions are, during the LGM, the last glacial maximum, are dry. So you've got these huge areas of desert, and they're very cold. Animals are moving out of them. Plants are gone. People are following the animals, and so everywhere in the Northern Hemisphere, everywhere people are moving into. We see this in the archaeological record of like Europe. People are moving into climactic refugia. This is probably also what is going on here. But and the southern coast of central Beringia, this whole area, you know, where the Aleutian Islands are, in fact, this whole area is actually modeled to be a much more comfortable climate. I don't think it was great, but it would have been a lot better than anywhere else. There were warmer temperatures, there was animals, plants, and birds, things that for people to eat. So it's circumstantial evidence that people might have been seeking refuge in this area. But we don't actually have any direct evidence of that because it's all underwater. And until we have submarines that are able to find the tiniest scraps of archaeological evidence in a very, very large area, I don't think it's gonna be very challenging to test this hypothesis. So some archaeologists believe that instead people were in East Asia or far, far south of Siberia. But a lot of geneticists, because that's where the archaeology shows us they're people, but a lot of geneticists take issue with that because the simple reason is that when you have populations near each other, they have sex. And we don't see any evidence of gene flow with this population at all. So we have a long way to go before we can resolve the question of where this isolation might have taken place. But as I said, there was a lot of stuff going on during this period, and one of the things that happened was a series of lineage splits. So one lineage I'm going to show up here. There's my cursor. Oh, my cursor is gone. Sorry. That's not good. Okay, now it's back. Apparently. Okay, here it is. One lineage right here is referred to as the ancient Beringians, and we know about it from the genomes of children from these two sites. We have not found any descendants of this population among contemporary individuals, contemporary indigenous peoples, but we can see them in the archaeological record, and it also may be a sampling issue because we don't have a whole lot of genomes from across Alaska. From the genomes of the contemporary Mixe and ancient Mexicans, we can also indirectly infer that there were at least two additional lineages. I'm going to go back one slide. This is one of them. And since my book was published, this figure is from my book, since my book was published, another lineage was found. So this is kind of updating this. There are at least 2 additional lineages that diverged during this period. And there may be others as well. And these 2 lineages are referred to as unsampled population A and unsampled population A2, which again, terrible names. And they're called unsampled because we don't actually have genomes from any member of that population. Instead, we can detect them from the evidence of gene flow into other populations. And again, there might be others as well, but we're going to need a lot more genetic data in order to see them. One possible interpretation for the pattern of rapid splits that we see is that, and I'm storytelling here, but it's plausible, the Beringians became isolated, right? And different groups of people are occupying this very, very large area. If gene flow between these groups was reduced because of geography, because of barriers or distance, then you might see the emergence of this population structure. Okay, so this all sets the stage for the peopling of the Americas, and let's talk about that next. The question of when people entered the Americas and by what routes is, as I said, a very dynamic area of study in our field today. I see this currently as there being 4 models to explain this process. And so for the next bit of this talk, I want to kind of talk about the strengths and the weaknesses of each model. But first, you might be wondering how on earth things could be so debated after so much research and there's so much evidence. How can people not agree yet? I'm going to quote one of my colleagues, Justin Holcomb, from a paper he wrote in 2022. And he said, "These discrepancies arise because settlement models are constructed from relatively few data points. So archaeological sites, limited fossil records, and ancient DNA. And different researchers maintain varying degrees of standards for accepting such evidence." So in other words, what evidence you accept is your framework for interpreting, for which model you might take. So I want to get into the nitty-gritty details of this so you can make up your own mind which model seems to be the best fit. But first, we're going to talk about climate. So I mentioned the last glacial maximum, the Ice Age, several times now. It influenced the landscape, and it places constraints on where people can move and where people can live. During the LGM, enormous quantities of water were bound up in massive ice sheets. And I mentioned this already, but in North America, basically everything south of Alaska was blocked by ice. So you could not move out of Alaska because you have this massive ice wall, which was formed from the joining of the Cordilleran and Laurentide glaciers. And of course, sea levels were a lot lower than they are today. So on average, they were 100 meters lower than they are today. And this is a GIF of coastline changes during the LGM beginning about 21,000 years ago. So you can see how different this is. And lighter colors are the land features. So people could get into Alaska, but they could not move very far out of it. Some archaeologists refer to it as a cul-de-sac. People could cross the Bering Land Bridge, or Beringia, it existed between about 50,000 and 11,000 years ago, but they could not get out of Alaska except for after potential routes began to open, and that would have happened as the LGM ended and the climate began to warm. The first route was along the Alaska coast by around 16 to 17,000 years ago. And the second route was in the interior of North America. We don't know exactly when it opened, but it was probably in the order of about 14,000 years ago. And it was certainly open and had people and animals traveling through it by about 13,000 years ago. So people could only have migrated out of Alaska before 25,000 years ago or after 19,000 years ago. So try to remember those 2 numbers because we're gonna come back to those. All right, so I want to start with the late dispersal model. And this basically states that people did not enter the Americas until after 14,000 years ago. And I need to trace the development of this idea for a little bit. If you're my age or older, and I see many people who are in my cohort here, you may have learned what's known as the Clovis first model in school. So this model took into account the sudden apparent widespread appearance of Clovis technologies. They're characterized by these beautiful bifacially flaked fluted, this is the flute right here, fluted projectile points. They would go onto the ends of spears. And you see them in the archaeological record all across North America beginning suddenly about 13,000 years ago. This is, I don't know, you probably can't see it, but this is a map of fluted point distributions across North America. It's a bit incomplete, but you can see Clovis points were widely distributed, and they appear very rapidly, and they're present very briefly before they're then replaced with other technologies. The Clovis first model suggests that people traveled across the Bering Land Bridge through this ice-free corridor along the Rocky Mountains and populated the continents quickly. And this model dominated the archaeological field in North America for about 50 years in the 20th century. And today this model is still around, kind of, but it's in a newer, more updated form. The archaeologists who favor it do so because they look very skeptically on any sites that predate Clovis, or any sites that predate 14,000 years ago. If you're confused by why archaeologists look at the same evidence and come to such wildly different conclusions, I think it's worth taking a few moments to go through how archaeologists determine what is evidence of human presence. And if there are archaeologists in the audience here, I'm sorry, I'm doing my best. I'm a geneticist. I will do my best. So the standard for interpreting a site, an early site, as evidence of humans is this. You have to have undisputable evidence of human presence. It has to be securely dated, and it has to be an undisturbed stratigraphic context. Or in other words, the site has to have some object that was clearly made by humans or used by humans, or humans themselves, human remains themselves, dated in a geological context that has not been disturbed or mixed with other layers. So that seems straightforward, right? This is the part where you get, I hope these slides show up. Okay, tell me, is this a tool or was it created naturally? Let's do a show of hands. How many people think it's a tool? And how many people think it was created naturally? Okay, so it's about 50-50. Many things can cause a stone to break, including normal geological processes like water. Even the actions of animals, like capuchin monkeys in South America, can actually result in the creation of broken rocks that can be mistaken for human tools. This particular rock, some archaeologists look at and see evidence for human presence 130,000 years ago at the Cerruti Mastodon site in California. Other archaeologists, probably most archaeologists, find these breakage patterns more convincingly explained by natural processes. Okay. So I'm not saying that you are wrong either way, but because I don't know, I can't tell if something's a tool, but I'm saying it's complicated. Okay. We will return to Cerruti in a little bit. All right, here's another one. Here's a bone. I hope you can see it. Okay, yeah, you see the scratches? Okay, are those made by humans or not? How many people think they were made by humans? Okay. How many people think they were made by something else like rodents or carnivores or rocks or some other non-human thing? Okay, again, 50-50, right? It's not easy. Okay, how do you tell? So if you thought this was made by humans, you are in good company with archaeologists who look at these scratches and see them as evidence for humans butchering animals, a signal of human presence at this somewhat controversial site over here, Bluefish Caves, which has been dated to 24,000 to 23,000 years ago. Others look at them more skeptically. And again, I would say probably most archaeologists would look at that skeptically, but some, including many of my colleagues at the University of Kansas, are more optimistic. So this is all an exercise to show you it is not completely straightforward. However, there are quite a few sites which are accepted by many archaeologists that predate Clovis, and this is a very old figure, so it doesn't show very many of them. In fact, it only shows like one site in Texas. I'm sorry, I apologize, but there are many sites that are accepted by archaeologists that predate Clovis. And I want to take a moment to point out that indigenous peoples of the Americas have maintained that they have been here a lot longer than 13,000 years, and they have steadfastly maintained this. So that is very important. At Page Ladson, here's a Texas connection. At Page Ladson, which is in Florida, but it was excavated by Texas archaeologists, Jesse Halligan and Mike Waters from Texas A&M. They found a fragment of a bifacially flaked knife, which I show here. I think it's just gorgeous. Along with another flake, the remains of a potentially butchered mastodon. This site is really important because it is not important. It's just a tiny pond in the middle of nowhere dating to 14,500 years ago. It's a nice place for animals to come and have a drink. But humans didn't visit this site very often. At least we don't have a whole lot of evidence for them visiting the site very often. It's a very sparse site. There's no evidence of human habitation in the area. But what it shows us, the isolation of this site, shows us something interesting. It's not what archaeologists expect to see when a population is moving across a landscape for the first time, as you might expect 14,500 years ago. Instead, it shows that people knew this site and they knew that they would be able to find animals there. They went there deliberately and they found something to eat and lost some knives in the process. This is, if you buy it, and not all archaeologists do, so don't hate me, archaeologists. I'm trying to represent all viewpoints fairly here. If you buy that this is evidence of people 14,500 years ago, it's also evidence that people are settled in. This is a term in archaeology, settled into a region. That means they know where resources are. They know the landscape. They have been there for some time. These pre-14,000-year-old sites, caveating, again, if they are legitimate, could not have been peopled by traveling down an ice-free corridor, at least as we understand the current landscape. This ice-free corridor was probably not fully deglaciated until 14,000 years ago, and these sites predate that. So the oldest archaeological evidence for human presence in the ice-free corridor along the Rocky Mountains dates to about 12,400 years ago. It also, interestingly, seems to be people moving northward, not southward. Environmental DNA taken from a lake sediment cores in the center of the corridor shows that it was not viable, so there weren't any plants or animals in the corridor until at least about 12,600 years ago. So I do not buy this as the initial route of entry for people into the Americas, although stay tuned because I'm about to contradict myself soon. I told you it's complicated. The West Coast, on the other hand, would have been deglaciated earlier by 16,000 years ago, maybe 17,000 years ago. And I and others believe that this, as well as the genetic data, which I'm going to show you in a moment, supports the coastal route as being the most likely way that people first got into the Americas. However, again, direct evidence for this is pretty sparse. We don't have boats. We don't have any sites dating to this time period along the West Coast because it's all underwater. Not all, but a lot of it is underwater. So this is a hypothesis that needs further testing with archaeological data. Okay, so because I'm a geneticist, I tend to favor the models best supported by genetic evidence, so I'm going to get into that next. So we're going to pick up the genetic story from where we left off. The last glacial maximum, several lineages have emerged. This population is isolated. One of these lineages is referred to as ancestral Native Americans. I'm showing it right here. Okay, so this is unsampled population A, ancestral Native Americans, and that lineage moves south of the ice sheets and becomes ancestral to the first peoples. All indigenous people south of the Arctic, I should say. The Arctic is populated much later in a series of migrations, which I'm not going to get into today, but it's also quite fascinating. The ancestral Native American lineage itself underwent several splits. I don't know if you can see this or not, but we'll do our best. And these splits happened just before and just after the massive North American glaciers begin to melt. We know of at least two minor branches, and this is new information. One of these is not in my book. Two minor branches. One of them is here at Spirit Cave. Wait, Spirit Cave's over here. One of them is here, this yellow dot right here. They're represented by very, very few genomes, so we don't know a whole lot about them. But then there are also two major branches, and these diverge after 17,000 years ago. They in fact diverged between 17,500 and 14,600 years ago. Seems like a coincidence, a nice coincidence that they're happening when you've got these routes opening up into the Americas, and you're seeing what geneticists expect to see when populations move into a new region. That is the diversification of lineages. People are moving around the landscape, exchanging genes less often, right? Exchanging DNA less often because of distance. And you have this emergence of this population structure. We still don't have a great understanding of the complete geographic distribution of southern Native Americans, depicted in purple here, but we know that all the genomes tested from South America, Central America, and most of them in North America. There aren't very many, but most of them in North America all belong to this lineage. The other lineage, NNA, which is represented by the blue up here, is people who are descended from the NNA branch, or Northern Native Americans, include Algonquians, Na-Dene, Salishan, and Tsimshian speakers from Canada. And everybody else is SNA. I know, I have to show dogs. Although I'm now regretting that I didn't put pictures of my dogs on here. I need to do that for the next time I give this talk. But puppies, you know. Okay, so in recent years, we've been able to get insights into human history from the genomes of dogs because, of course, it's brilliant. Dogs move with people. And in fact, Native American dogs in the Americas, are descended from Siberian dogs. Genetically, it's very clear linkage. And in fact, human and dogs have a very ancient relationship. So we co-evolved as domestic partners. They are the first domesticated animals, and they were actually domesticated in the Upper Paleolithic. Really wonderful, when wolves began spending time with humans. So if you look at the genomes of dogs, and this is, as far as I know, only been done with mitochondrial DNA, maternally inherited DNA, but hopefully we'll learn more in the future. If you look at the lineage patterns of dogs and the splits of dogs, you have one clade that's remains in Northeast Asia, but then you have another clade that comes into the Americas, and it is geographically structured. There are 4 lineages right here. And these lineages separate at about the same time, more or less, as NNA, SNA splitting into Northern Native Americans, Southern Native Americans in North America, Southern Native Americans in Central America, and Southern Native Americans in South America. These splitting patterns, these branching patterns, match each other almost perfectly. It's amazing. So the dog story, I cannot wait to learn more about this and see if it's confirmed with complete nuclear DNA, which is much more robust and precise, but we'll have to wait and see what happens. And this is a study by Angela Perry and her colleagues. Okay, so in summary, the genetic evidence seems to support, on its face, both from humans and dogs, a pre-Clovis migration sometime around the end of the last glacial maximum. But I keep teasing you and saying, there's some evidence that contradicts it. Let's talk about the evidence for an even earlier migration. There is an increasing number of publications, including many in the last couple of years, that claim they have evidence of people in the Americas, a lot in South America and Central America, prior to the LGM, prior to 25,000 years ago. I should caveat this by saying most archaeologists are pretty skeptical of them for reasons which we have already gone into, right? Flakes, are they tools? Are they made by humans? Are they not? But what I want to do, so the major problem with a lot of these sites from the perspective of most archaeologists is that they're not incontrovertible evidence of human presence, okay? But I want to talk about one of them, which is, and that is white sands, and I'm sure lots of you guys know about white sands. In 2021, just as I was wrapping up the final edits to my book, it was great timing. I knew this was coming though, so it was okay. I was able to slip a little bit into my book. Bennett et al. Published this bombshell paper announcing there were footprints at the white sands site in White Sands National Park in New Mexico, dating to between 23 and 21,000 years ago, implying that, again, I asked you to remember those 2 dates, people would have had to have entered the Americas before 25,000 years ago in order to get past the ice sheets. This was, of course, immediately controversial for technical reasons having to do with the seeds that they dated that were buried inside the footprints that tend to return older radiocarbon dates when tested when they're in aquatic environments. A lot of complicated technical stuff there, but short answer, it was very, very debated. But in 2023, so I'm giving you guys the latest, the team announced that they'd redated the footprints with 2 independent methods, not having to do with that old carbon effect, and all 3 approaches returned the same dates. So this looks pretty good. I'm convinced. I know not all my colleagues are, and so there is still a robust debate about white sands, but more people, I think, have been persuaded that this might be a legitimate sign of human presence. I can get into white sands, but for the sake of time, I cannot. I just beg you to read about it. It's the most amazing site. Amazing. Okay. Okay, and then I cannot not tell you about this last model, which is one that a few archaeologists argue, and this is a very small group of archaeologists, who what I'm calling the very, very, very early migration model, which for some reason is, sorry for the formatting, I did this in a Mac. This very, 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 very early migration model is based upon the Cerruti mastodon site, which I mentioned earlier. So this site contains several rocks found among the remains of some late Pleistocene mammals, including those of a young mastodon whose bones had been damaged. And the authors said that this damage was consistent with butchering, spiral green stick fracturing, and then the rocks have been used as hammerstones and anvils, and this points to a human presence at the site 137,000 years ago. So this came out in Science, or was it Nature? Nature. This came out in Nature. I mean, this was a huge deal. Nature, if you don't know, is like the premier journal in science. The majority of the archaeological community has found problems with the site. The stratigraphy, we've talked about evidence of a human presence. They dispute it. Some argue there are natural explanations for how the bones were damaged. Also, there was a construction site there, and so they thought perhaps, some archaeologists have suggested perhaps construction equipment did the damage. I should say that Holland and his colleagues have argued very spiritedly against the critiques, but at this point, the majority of the archaeological community does not find these arguments persuasive. And it's at odds with the genetic evidence, and it's also at odds with what we know about human evolution, or what we think we know about human evolution that I talked about earlier. While we see evidence for sapiens expanding their range outside of Africa early, we don't see any evidence that they expanded it quite that far north. And we also north by going to Siberia and crossing the land bridge. And we also don't see any evidence of Neanderthals and Denisovans doing something similar. So at this point, this model is out there. I don't find it persuasive right now, but it is a testable model. And if it holds true, then we will find more evidence for this. Okay. So I've said a couple times we seem to have a mismatch between the story DNA tells us and the story the archaeological record seems to tell us. If we are to accept white sands at face value, let's do that for the sake of argument. And this is the part of the talk where I'm going to speculate wildly, so please don't quote me, although I guess I'm going to be on video doing this, so that'll be embarrassing. But okay, so how can we, if we have evidence of people in the Americas before the last glacial maximum, how can we have the majority of genetic evidence showing a later migration? So speculation, one thing could be that the peoples in white sands just did not leave any descendants that we can detect right now. That happens a lot, right? This is very true. This has happened a lot in the course of human history. I can point to many, many different populations in Eurasia where they left no contemporary descendants. But we should also remember that we are missing a lot of data, and I will show you a figure in a minute here that kind of drives home this point. We don't have a lot of Native American genomes from the past or the present. So maybe they did leave descendants and we're just missing that signal. Possibly the descendants of population Y migrated into the Americas early, like we discussed, before the LGM, and maybe they or a population like them left these footprints. In either case, if people came here 25,000 years ago, they could have traveled overland because those glaciers weren't there. So again, now we've got to open up again this overland route, and possibly that was the way people got into the Americas. We have no archaeological evidence for any of this. All we know is that maybe there were people in white sands who left these footprints 23,000 years ago. And it's amazing, and it's a very, very exciting time to be working in this field. But we can't answer any more questions without additional genomic evidence. But here's the figure I was going to tell you about. We have major gaps in the genetic records of both South and North America. This is a bit out of date. It's from 2021, but these are the number of individuals from whom we have genomes from the past. It gives you a pretty good idea, and I just want to call your attention to the gaps, especially North America here. Like we just have no idea what genetic variation is like there. Contemporary Indigenous Americans are also underrepresented. They're, in fact, the least represented in genetic cohorts of genetic studies today. So only about 0.05% of Indigenous peoples currently participate in genetics research. They're underrepresented as researchers as well. So Native Americans represent 2.2% of the population in the United States, but only 0.8% of those are doctoral degree holders. I used to know every single geneticist who was Indigenous in the United States. I don't anymore. That's positive progress, but this lack of representation is not, I repeat, not because Native Americans are anti-science. Some people have made claims that they are. That is not true at all. Instead, it is mainly attributable, I think, other Indigenous peoples in the audience perhaps can speak up and share this if they agree with this perspective or not. But I think it is largely because of a long and shameful history of harms being done to Indigenous communities and structural exclusion from the roles of researchers themselves. The founder of my field, physical anthropology in the United States, Alice Herlichka, this guy, oversaw the creation of an enormous collection of skeletons at the Smithsonian from populations all over the world. One estimate places this at 33,000 individuals. And Indigenous ancestors comprise a large part of that collection. And most, probably, many at least, were collected without permission from present-day descendants. I know this because I have worked with contemporary tribes who are trying to get their ancestors back from these collections. And these collections are present at institutions all over the United States. And the presence of these ancestors in these collections continues to cause distress and harm to contemporary peoples. And lest you think this was all in the past, contemporary genomics research continues to be problematic in some cases. This is just one example of a study, a critique of a study that was ethically fraught. There is currently an intense discussion about the ethics of paleogenomics research in the Americas, in the United States in particular, and fortunately, Indigenous scientists have proposed numerous ethical frameworks. They are telling us, non-native researchers, how to do this work in a good way. And our field is moving in a better direction, but we've got a long way to go. Not everybody is really following these frameworks. And there are other issues as well, particularly when it comes to ancient DNA research with ancestors. There are some tribes for whom the disturbance of their ancestors' remains is absolutely unacceptable. And we non-native researchers have to respect that. And this is a very complicated topic. I want to stress that every tribe, every nation, every community has a different perspective on this. I want to share this quote from geneticist Dr. Justin Lund, who gave a talk for the American Association of Physical Anthropologists in 2021. He likened the discipline of genetics and archaeology to houses with crumbling foundations, and he advocated for foundational repair by mending relationships with Indigenous groups. And he said, creating bad relationships took generations, and mending these relationships will also take generations, so plan accordingly. If your work begins and ends in the lab, you're doing it wrong. Many Indigenous geneticists and non-Indigenous allies, as I said, are working together to provide guidelines for researchers, but they stress that there's no single one-size-fits-all approach to conducting genetic research. But research can be successful when scientists respect tribal sovereignty, when they work in partnership with tribes and communities who do want to use DNA to explore their histories, when they listen when tribes say no to research, and when they do their research with care and concern and respect for a tribe's priorities and their own concerns. I don't have time in this talk to do this justice, but this topic is a big one in my field. And as I said, I think my field is moving in a better direction, although we have a long way to go. It is important to understand that this is not just an esoteric bit of history. We're not just asking questions that don't really affect people's lives today. Since the first coming of settlers to the Americas, the very question of the origin of Native Americans is bound up intimately with settler colonialism. So Europeans were shocked when they encountered people who were not described in the Bible. There was a general refusal to believe that Native Americans could have been responsible for the spectacular monuments and artworks, many of which you can see in this museum. They're an extraordinary museum exhibit here. And Europeans instead manufactured elaborate mythologies to explain their presence. And so most of these stories featured some version of a lost race, advanced people who were wiped out by contemporary Native Americans. And the bones and the artifacts that they found and that were collecting, that they were pillaging these mounds to collect and put in their museums, were to them clearly the remains of this lost race. And the identity of the lost race was controversial, but many believed them to be Europeans. It's very convenient. Or Atlanteans. We see echoes of this today in the so-called alternative histories in popular media. And I'm going to go on a bit of a rant here. I apologize. I'm not going to apologize. This is important. There is currently a very high-budget, slick, popular show on Netflix, and people who are laughing know exactly what I'm talking about, which writer Graham Hancock uses to promote this very idea, that the monuments and achievements of ancient cultures, including indigenous peoples of the Americas, can't be explained by the evidence that archaeologists and indigenous peoples themselves put forward, but instead are due to the help of a prior lost civilization that was wiped out by a great flood triggered by comets or something about 12,000 years ago. He's a bit coy these days about who this civilization was, but in the past he's identified it as Atlantis. And somehow he got Keanu Reeves on the show, which is very disappointing because I really like him. You know, people can argue, oh, this is just harmless fun, whatever. But let me persuade you otherwise, and I'm going to show you two slides, the next two slides, and I want to give you a heads up, a warning right now. They are very racist. Okay, so, you know, brace yourselves. Just a few days ago, the Express published an article showing the direct influence of Hancock's work on Nazis. Specifically, this guy named Hardy Lloyd, who says listening to Hancock is like listening to Third Reich archaeology without the baggage. And I can watch it with somebody else. And he adds, it's a good way of introducing people to white superiority. It's a little introduction, a little intro to racialism. Okay. Now Hancock, to be fair, has pushed back on this very strongly. He says, I utterly detest and reject any kind of racial supremacism. Good for him. I'm glad he did that. But he does not acknowledge or accept that the narrative that he is promoting aligns with the story, and the story that he has been telling for years. This is a quote from his blog right there, with some really problematic language. We do not use those words. It's unfortunate because his theories, which are amplified and broadcast to millions, are amplifying an anti-indigenous trope that has been around since Europeans first came to the Americas. Okay, now this is really racist. Well, this is racist, but I'm gonna show you some more racist stuff. Okay, so we just had Indigenous Peoples Day, which is, you know, called by some Columbus Day. There's an entire industry of alt-right, so-called race realists who generate memes like this. And there was a expose in The Guardian about this a few weeks ago, about this industry, so you can read about that. But anyway, they're putting this stuff out there. I saw this posted on social media on Indigenous Peoples Day as an attempt to justify colonialism. This is all to say that what we do and what we say and the media that we consume matters. So learning about the cultures and histories of indigenous peoples will not fix this by itself, but it is a good step. And in that spirit, in the honor of the peoples whose lands we are currently on, including the Karankawa, the Akokisa, the Ishak, the Sana, and the over 60 to 70,000 Native Americans who call this city their home today, I invite you to take the time to learn about their histories, and I provided you with some resources here. These are QR codes, you can scan them. We'll take you to these websites, I hope, if they're working. And you can also learn about the histories of the lands that you yourself live on and work on if you're not from here. This is a great resource right here. I use this in all my talks. Oh, I can't. Oh, there we go. It's right here. And if you feel so moved, I also invite you to join me in donating today to the American Indian Center of Houston, which helps out indigenous peoples in this city and provides them with community and support. And there is a link to donate right there. Okay, so I'm going to close by acknowledging the indigenous and non-indigenous scholars whose work has influenced my thinking on these issues, and I want to stress that much of this presentation is built on a foundation of their public scholarship. These are some, but by no means all, of the people who's influenced my approach to research. And these are ways to get in touch with me, more QR codes, and follow my work, and I'm very happy to take questions. If you'll click one more.
That was fantastic. So we do have a few questions coming in. The first one, do the language groups line up with the DNA groups, or did language differentiation come later?
That is a great question. So I am not a linguistic anthropologist. I will do my best. They don't align perfectly. Sometimes they do align, sometimes they don't. It's like archaeology. You can see sometimes a clear differentiation between archaeological culture and genetic lineage, and sometimes you don't. And that's because languages are shared very commonly, right? How many people in here speak more than one language? Yeah, see, there's an example right there. I wish I did. And so there's a lot of sharing of terminology, and so the language, the methods used for linguistic studies also only go back so far into the past, right, before things get a little blurry. But the answer is it's complicated. I know, I always answer questions that way, I'm sorry.
No worries. Okay, the next one. What are your thoughts regarding the recent developments supporting that indigenous peoples were here long before coming over via the Bering Strait, and that some indigenous peoples call that a myth?
I cannot speak to whether or not indigenous peoples believe things are myths or not. That is not my place. But I think I kind of answered that question with kind of an exploration of the evidence for these different models. If you want to know what I think personally, I'm a bit skeptical about the really early dates, the really very, very, very early peopling, because this is one site. I don't see a whole lot of, I see other explanations potentially for people, for how those bones could have been broken in those rocks. But I'm not an archaeologist, so I'm probably not the best person to ask about that. I think the genetic record gives us a pretty clear signal of migration, as I've just explained, but I also find the White Sands evidence to be very persuasive. So I am working very hard to kind of think about ways in which we can reconcile the genetic evidence and the archaeological evidence for this very early migration. And I gave you some of my half-baked, unformed thoughts already, so we need to do a lot more work.
Okay, the next question. Is the turmoil amongst the geneticized anthropological community have any weirdness to it, such as Dr. Melba Ketchum's work on living humanoids? Is there new evidence?
Dr. Melba Ketchum, that is an old school. Okay, I love that. I love that. I actually use the Bigfoot Genome Project and as a teaching tool sometimes. For those of you who don't know about this Melba Ketchum sequence, allegedly sequenced a Bigfoot genome, it's a really fascinating thing. Actually, she's Texan, isn't she? So there's a local connection. Anyway, is there weirdness like that? Not among my colleagues, no, but there are it's kind of fraud, isn't it? There is a sort of industry of people who try to claim that they can sequence your DNA and tell you what tribe you are belonging to. You can't, you cannot, that is not a thing. Indigenous peoples have mixed a lot, and tribes are very, genetically very diverse, and you cannot identify somebody genetically based on tribe. But there are people who market DNA tests to, let's be blunt, non-native people who wish to show that they are native in some way. And so that is pretty weird, I think, yeah.
So don't fall for the scam.
No, don't. DNA cannot tell you that you are indigenous at all. I mean, I say this as a geneticist. This is my whole field. It cannot tell you that. It can tell you, it can help you make connections, but being native, being part of a tribe is a cultural connection, legal definition. There's a whole bunch of stuff, and I, as a geneticist, cannot tell somebody that they are native or not, and nobody else should be able to do that either. It's my rant over. Okay.
Okay, the next question. Can you speak to the AI-enhanced version 07 Oxford Nanopore Minion,
No.
advanced PCR techniques, specialized IX PCR qual wave primers using AIS AI Intel tech contributing to or causing the professional community turmoil?
Who asked me that question?
There's more to it.
Oh absolutely not. You know who you want to ask that question of? You want to ask that question of my good friend Ewan Birney, who is the director of the European Molecular Biology Laboratory, or associate director or something, and one of the sequencers of the human genome. He's one of the Human Genome Project people, and he is also a nanopore expert. And so I will refer your question to him. If you tweet it at me, I will get you that question. I will get that question in front of him, and he'll answer it. Sorry, Ewan, I'm throwing you under the bus here. I cannot answer that, I'm sorry.
And this one, which you covered a little bit, but what is your opinion as a surrogate Houstonian about the fringe stuff such as Graham Hancock? Boneyard mammoth find in Alaska? Are there really any actual skeletons of giants hidden away in the basement of the museum? Is there zero actual exotic artifacts, archaeological or geneticized anthropological? Is ancient aliens in TV all crap or any sheds of truth?
Who asked that one? I love you. You're the best. Okay. No, there's no evidence of any of that. Oh my gosh. I have been in the basement of the Smithsonian. There are no giant skeletons in there. I mean, although I don't know why you would trust me to answer that question, because obviously I'm part of the system of nefarious scientists who are trying to suppress the truth. I hope, if anything, that my presentation here and going through all these different models, including ones I don't agree with, can convince you that, we're not as rigid and closed-minded as we're portrayed to be by the alt history community. But no, what I've told you is I think my best faith effort at giving you all of the evidence as it currently stands, I mean, not all, obviously, but, a fair sampling of the evidence. These sort of alternative narratives are really fun for people to think about, but I think there's a darker side to them. I think that it undermines, trust in institutions. I mean, well, this is true of everything right now, but undermines trust in institutions, trust in scientists. We have our own trust problems that we have to deal with, and most of them are stemming from our unethical behavior towards Indigenous peoples. We need to grapple with that, and so, fair. But we're not suppressing evidence of Bigfoot or giants or anything like that because we're getting paid so much to do it. That's not the case. So, but again, you don't have to trust me because I am part of the system. So, yeah.
All we have in the basement are classrooms, a shark exhibit.
Sharks? Oh, cool.
Astronomy, and then our offices. What are the stories from Indigenous peoples that explain the belief that Indigenous people have been here longer than the current models represent? And should we give their stories more weight given the history of settler colonialism and discrimination against Native peoples?
Should we give our stories more weight? Absolutely, yes, 100%. What are the stories? I mean, I'm gonna say they're not mine to tell you, so I don't think I should be telling you them. I'm not an expert on the Indigenous stories. I work with tribes who have stories of migration. They do not see a conflict between their traditional histories and archaeological and genetic evidence at all. Some tribes do. Some tribes view themselves as having come from a place and that they have been there forever. And others use the phrase since time immemorial, which I think is a lovely and perfect phrase to use for describing the deep past. But every tribe has a different story. Every tribe has a different history. I don't like to use the word story. I don't like to use the word myth to describe these. I call them history because they are just as valid a history, I think, as anything that we can produce. They're just different, relying on different evidence. So.
One of the largest misconceptions about the indigenous populations of North America is that they did not have larger population center, but site like Cahokia Mounds, Poverty Point, and Pueblo Bonito. Does ancient genetic studies speak to the prevalence of organized population centers in North America?
I would love it to. You are absolutely right. There were large populations. We can tell that from the archaeology. But we are not at a state of research where we have enough genomes that we can actually do that. I think I showed you how few genomes we have from North America, right? It is very, very difficult to estimate past population sizes with the few data that we have from North America, at least. I'm not an expert in the South American genome, so I don't speak to that. But what we can see are some trends. And so we can see, and I'm gonna talk about something that's called effective population size. That is a concept in population genetics that is not the same thing as population size, census population size, right? Okay, just to get that clear. But we can see trends in effective population size and rising and falling and starting out very sparse early in the sort of history of the Americas, increasing rapidly and then decreasing very, very sharply upon European contact. That's really all I can tell you right now, though, because the state of our research is still pretty small. Other geneticists might be able to give you a better answer to that, I'm not sure. Yeah.
How do the more recent large-scale population settlements in Central America play into these ideas? Were those populations much more recent?
Yes, and I'm not really talking about kind of more, population histories that you would be more familiar with. I'm not really talking about in this this talk because I'm ending at the Holocene. So we have skipped a lot of history that includes the origins of agriculture and migration and warfare and incredible technological achievements, which I only have so much time, so. I kind of stuck to what's in my book, but I was ending just at the Holocene. There's a lot more to discover, and I'm hoping to write another book someday, kind of covering from the Holocene through later time periods. We'll have to see if there's interest in that. So, yeah.
We would definitely.
Well, thank you. If I have time to write it.
Were the earliest humans more communal or individualistic in nature?
Oh my gosh, I don't know. Do we have any paleontologists in the room? If you're talking about the earliest humans, like earliest sapiens, I don't know what their natures were like, but there is a strong argument to be made that the reason that sapiens was so successful in terms of population numbers and societies is that we are very community oriented, we're very social. You can see that genetically. Compare the effective population size of Homo sapiens populations to that of Neanderthals. Neanderthal population sizes were very small. And at least later Neanderthals were quite isolated geographically from each other. There was not a lot of long-range gene flow where there was with sapiens populations. So yes, evidence seems to suggest that sapiens was very, very social. Whether that is sort of in our nature, I don't know, but it was certainly part of our practice. So.
Why does DNA from the Levant show up in the native populations of the Great Lakes region, such that haplogroup X?
I knew you were talking about X. Okay. Haplogroup X is, gosh, I should have made a slide on this. Haplogroup X is a lineage, mitochondrial lineage. So I didn't even get into the difference between mitochondrial DNA and nuclear DNA, but your mitochondria are organelles, the powerhouse of the cell, for those of you. I had to, I'm sorry. Your mitochondria are little organelles in your cells, and they have their own genome, which is separate from your nuclear genome. It's very small, about 16,000 something bases, and it's strictly inherited maternally because they come from your mother, from the egg that your mother produced, and that contains her DNA and so far. So you can use mitochondrial DNA to track the population histories of women. The nuclear genome is much bigger. It's inherited from both your parents, so forth and so on. Okay. Earlier, ancient DNA studies were mostly done on mitochondrial DNA because it's much more abundant and you're more likely to get it than nuclear DNA. And what was found was that Native Americans belonged to what we call haplogroups, or collections of lineages that are related to each other. And there were 5, A, B, C, D, and X. X is quite geographically limited, so it, as you say, in the Great Lakes region initially, and it shares an ancestor with other lineages in the Middle East and also in South. I think the Middle East and a few other places, and also in Europe. Okay, some people have looked at that and said, well, that's evidence that Europeans crossed the Atlantic. I didn't even talk about this hypothesis, but it's wrong. It's evidence that Europeans crossed the Atlantic and were the first peoples of the Americas. They colonized America. I'll get into why that is later. I think we're kind of running out of time. But anyway, the truth is that the lineages that are present, haplogroup X lineages that are present in these other populations are not ancestral to the ones present in Native Americans. They are, in fact, akin to cousin lineages, share a shared grandparent, if I can extend that metaphor. And that grandparent, we don't have that grandparent sampled directly anywhere, but was probably in Eurasia in one of those early populations that I showed you. And these are just common descendants of that ancestor. I wrote a whole paper about this a while ago, so I can share it with you if you want. And in fact, another piece of evidence against the idea that these Europeans brought haplogroup X to the Americas is that the very oldest individual from whom we have haplogroup X is Kennewick Man, or the ancient one, who's actually found in the Pacific coast area, not the Atlantic coast. And he is, his haplogroup is basal. It's a lineage that is older and ancestral to that of the Great Lakes people. So we can actually kind of trace the footsteps back a little bit. We just can't connect with that grandparent yet. There's more, but I'll stop there.
That was actually the next question.
Oh my gosh.
About any chance people came to the Americas via the Atlantic Ocean?
Well, okay, some people did, and they're called Vikings. And yes, we have archaeological evidence of them, but they didn't seem to have left any genetic evidence, which is interesting, right? But we have no genetic or archaeological evidence of Solutreans, which is where we're going with this, right? The Solutrean culture. People believe that these bifacially flaked stone tools, the Clovis tools, and the Solutrean points, they're made with a similar technique. Sorry, archaeologists, I'm going to butcher this, but they're made with a similar technique called overshot flaking. I don't know how to do it, but I'm told it's the same technique. However, there is a many thousand years time period gap between the two cultures, and also it is not inconceivable that two cultures could independently invent the same way for flaking tools. And I am told by archaeologists that, in fact, there is no direct ancestral descendant connection between the Solutrean points and Clovis points. And the only individual from whom we have a genome, the only Clovis individual from whom we have a genome, does not have a trace of European ancestry whatsoever. And that is true of all of the first peoples of the Americas prior to European contact. There is no evidence of any European DNA in them. So that is very persuasive to me. So.
Many years ago, I saw a Nova episode that suggested maritime exploration and settlement, maybe from areas around Japan. Is this completely unfounded and unsupported?
No, I don't think so. We don't have any real evidence of that. But as I said, it does seem to be that there was migration by boat along the West Coast. At least I think that genetic patterns suggest that. Although who knows now with white sands? I don't know. But it is quite possible that it is certain that people were a lot more mobile than we give them credit for. And I just got done saying they didn't cross the Atlantic because we don't have any evidence for that except Vikings. But we do have evidence for interactions much later, though. This is not the initial peopling of the Americas, much later. We have interactions between Native Americans and Southeast Asians on Rapa Nui, right? That is pretty well established now, including genetic interactions. Now, this would have been not too long before European contact, so we're talking about a whole different time scale here. But yes, people moving around, right? But were they leaving evidence genetically and archaeologically? Not as much. At least I think we are seeing it when it is there. We see the Vikings, we see these interactions in Rapa Nui. So yeah, we're pretty good at finding these things, I hope. So yeah.
Okay. Is there genetic evidence that links the ancient Mexia to Utah? Apparently there are stories that got passed down that tell of a homeland with red rocks and 4 rivers which point to Utah.
I don't know. I am not, that is much after my area of specialization, so I can't answer that question, sorry.
Is there any genetic evidence of mixtures with African, European, or West Asian populations prior to known historical contacts?
No. There's not. So.
Okay, and with that, so there are people that have requested your contact information, so if you want to go back a slide.
Yes.
But we will also share that in an email that will go out to everybody afterwards. So you'll have her contact information along with the slide that has the resources for the Indigenous. And then with that, please help me thank Dr. Jennifer Raff, and we will see you all upstairs.
Thank you all. This has been a pleasure.